Hello everyone, it's Mr. C here, and today's video is all about the abolition of slavery, which was a cause that started in the 1790s to end the terrible slave trade and eventually slavery in itself. The Slave Trade Act was passed in 1807 and slavery was abolished in the British Empire in the 1830s. And we're going to try and go through a journey of London today to look at a bit of the story, the history of that, focusing on a few individuals. We will come back to Westminster. I'm in a very crowded Parliament Square, so we're going to go look around the city to see some sites and some people associated with the abolition of slavery, and then we'll come back here, maybe somewhere quieter, to discuss the actual process of the laws. Actually, when I first got here, there was a lone piper. He's playing some Highland Fling sort of thing now, but when I got here, I just got it, he was playing Amazing Grace. Very, very appropriate on our story of abolition, because that became the hymn of the abolition movement. Behind me is the Royal Exchange, and to my right is the Bank of England, here in the heart of the City of London. Now, it is fair to say that the City of London, in many, many ways, was built on slavery. Certainly a lot of the wealth that is still here today, its vestiges, its origins perhaps also lie in certainly the British Empire and slavery within that. And this was part of the challenge the abolitionists faced. It had made a lot of people a lot of money, and they were not going to give up on this horrendous trade easily. The other reason why I brought you here to the Royal Exchange is because even today, what's very interesting behind me, you probably would miss it if you were just walking past, is what is known as a frieze, a carving in the building. And hopefully just about where my finger is here, I'll zoom in there. I think it's there, but I'll zoom in after this. It's actually a depiction of an enslaved man, an enslaved African. He's the only person in that frieze who's still kneeling down, looking upon his master. The odd thing is that this building and this frieze was actually built after the abolition of slavery. So why is it there? We actually don't know. Some of the benefactors, the people who gave money for this building, did have associations with the slave trade. I don't know why it's here. Should it still be here? Should it not? Is it a memory of the horrendous trade and should not be seen anymore? Or is it actually a good example of where we have come from? Perhaps you can decide and tell me in the comments. I'm standing in George Yard, which is in the City of London, the heart of the City of London. Bank of England's just over the way over that way. And this is a sort of quiet square, because I'm here on the weekend, full of modern buildings, but it has got a very strong historical, important impact, because behind me is number 2 George Yard, now a very modern building. But in the year 1787, it was actually a bookshop and a publisher and a printer. And in 1787, a meeting was taking place, and a committee was formed. That committee was the Committee for the Effect of the Abolition of the Slave Trade. The abolition movement started here in this quiet and slightly forgotten courtyard, which looks very, very different today. There is a church behind me, which may have existed at the time. And there is a little tiny corner of a pub, the George and Vulture. Perhaps that was there. And just down there, I don't know if you quite see the alley, it's a very, very, very famous Dickensian pub, the Jamaica, in the Jamaica Coffee House, Wine House. But it's the abolition meeting that took place. 2 very significant people were there. Grenville Sharp, who ended up becoming a quite significant lawyer for many different African peoples for their freedom and for their defence, and if they've been horrendously treated. He took on, for example, the Zong case, the slave ship that was sunk and with a horrendous loss of life. Also here was Oladiah Equiano, who, of course, was a freed slave. He had come to, he had been in slavery, and he'd come to London. He had been freed, and 2 years later, 1789, he had written and published a book about his experiences on slavery, which kept this movement going and going. So, as I say, it started here, the abolition movement, in 1787. It took them 20 years to finally achieve abolition. But it all has to start somewhere, and it started here. Behind me is the Holy Trinity Church in Clapham, on Clapham Common. And I'm actually here on a Sunday, and it's a very busy gathering out there at the moment. And in the 1790s, this would also have been a very, very busy church, notably with a group of people known as the Clapham Sect. They were a group of abolitionists led by various different people, notably Zachary Macaulay, the Venn brothers, and of course William Wilberforce, who we'll mention in quite a bit as we go round. And in the 1790s and beyond, they met here for their religious gatherings, and they would speak about the horrors of slavery and trying to drum up support for the abolitionist movement. And I think this is one of the key things to highlight here, is actually the Christian religious element that runs through the abolitionist movement. They believed that it was unchristian to keep slaves. It was totally immoral to treat other human beings like this. And they gathered a lot of motion here, and a lot of public outcry would have come through it. And William Wilberforce, one of our key figures here, really led that through. The other really thing I find very interesting is just quite literally across the road from the Holy Trinity, there's a bunch of very posh houses. It's now a hospice, the Royal Trinity Hospice. But in the 1790s, that was home to a man called George Hibbert, who was a prominent slave owner and slave trader. And he was vehemently against William Wilberforce in Parliament, against the Abolition of Slavery Act. And what I think would be, I almost certainly would have happened, is George Hibbert would have been sitting in here on a Sunday for his church service. And I really hope that William Wilberforce or others were in the pulpit condemning his immoral behaviour and his unchristian behaviour. And I really hope that was quite uncomfortable for him. Another eminent abolitionist was John Hatchard. He owned a bookshop which he opened in 1801, just before the abolition of slavery. And in this bookshop they held and they sold pamphlets about why slavery should be abolished, and they held meetings about the abolition movement. And that shop still exists today here on Piccadilly, and it hasn't changed much since. Shall we go and have a look inside? Behind me is the London Docklands Museum. It's a really good idea to go inside there because they have some fantastic exhibits about slavery. The whole third floor is dedicated to it. Most importantly, they have the table that was owned by Thomas Buxton, where the bill that was being passed through Parliament for the abolition was actually written and debated on. So go in there to see where that took place. Just outside the Docklands Museum is something also very interesting. It's an empty statue plinth. That's because a few years ago there was a person who was a slave trader who was on the statue, a man called Robert Milligan, and his statue has now been removed as of 2020. So it's interesting that a museum which celebrates the abolition of slavery and has a museum of portraying the horrors of slavery has also got outside it a statue now that represents our modern take on slavery. Well, the abolitionist movement faced a lot of revolt and a lot of opposition in Parliament when it was first introduced in the 1790s, the Act to End the Slave Trade. And it wasn't passed until 1807. It took 20 years of arguing, etc. And Wilberforce and others would have faced opposition from people, who were making money from the slave trade. So they're not going to, many of them were sitting members of Parliament. So they're not going to, turkeys don't vote for Christmas in that sense. So it took a lot of planning and convincing others. Eventually things got a little bit better, but at first they were kind of distracted. There were lots of events going on in the 1790s that pushed, unfortunately, the Abolition Act down the list of priorities. The American Revolution, the French Revolution, King George III with his porphyria and his madness. So it wasn't until the 1790s that it gained a bit more traction. And then in 1800, things got a bit more significant when Ireland entered the Union, and Irish MPs joined the movement, about 100 Irish MPs who were all keen on abolition of slavery, and that eventually helped them push through. So at first only the slave trade was abolished. What was the slave trade? Well, that was the triangular trade, the idea of from Britain to Africa, where there would be guns and metal goods and food, etc., whatever the case. They would sell that to African communities in Africa for slaves, who would then go across the Atlantic, known as the Middle Passage, to America, to the Caribbean, to South America, where they were sold as slaves, and then the triangle would be completed from the North America to Britain in the form of tobacco, sugar, etc., etc. That was abolished in 1807. Slavery itself in the British Empire was not abolished until 1834, so it did take a while to abolish all of slavery, but because the slave trade was abolished, it became less profitable and fewer slaves. Now, there is a memorial to the abolition of slavery, and it's called The Guilt of Cain, which is the name of a poem by Lemony Sissay, which I would recommend you giving a read. But it is this rather elegant and really quite beautiful bit of granite statues here. And what's interesting about them is they can represent two different things, whichever the perspective you want to look at the abolition of the slave trade from. You can start here with this, now it's essentially steps going up to a lectern. You can look at it in two different ways. One that represents the pulpit, the religious pulpit of priests, etc., because that was many of the origins of the abolition of the slave trade, because many of the abolitionists, William Wilberforce, Thomas Newton, whose church was just near here, they preached from the pulpit that this is a terrible thing, slavery, it must be abolished, and that's the religious element. It could also represent an auctioneer's stand, where auctioneers would auction the slaves to be bought, and indeed they will be represented by these the various different sort of plinths or megaliths, etc., that are along here. These are also potentially represent the people listening to the abolitionists, the tribe of saying yes, we should abolish it. And the final thing that these could also represent is sugarcane, which is part of the design for it as well. But it sits kind of in this empty bit of the city, London, really, just behind French Church Street Station. But it is a really pleasant place, despite the banging, a really pleasant place to come and sit and to reflect on the abolition movement. But this is the Buxton Memorial Fountain. It's actually a drinking fountain, and it memorialises all those emancipators, including William Wilberforce and, of course, Thomas Buxton, whose table we saw, where they signed they debated and argued what the act was going to be. But here is perhaps a good place to end. Over my right shoulder, the place of power of the legislation, where finally the abhorrent slave trade was abolished, and then over my left shoulder, the memorial to those who got that push through. And it's something that cannot be forgotten, and it's something that should be celebrated, that these men pushed through these reforms and got slavery abolished. This, and in the British Empire, of course, famously slavery, which was brought to America, was not abolished until 1865. And interestingly, this memorial was built in 1864 during the American Civil War, a war of which slavery was fought over. So slavery was still apparent when this was being built, a main key partner. Of course, there are examples of slavery still in existence today, and it's a legacy that builds on and on. It's things that cannot be forgotten and things that still need to be discussed in the places of power, and things need to be done about it. So come see the memorials, celebrate these men who did this, but also remember there is still a bit of a way to go.